More than 6,000 bombs have been dropped on Gaza, which is just 25 miles long.
And as Israel pounds Gaza in the fiercest day of bombing yet, Israeli troops are massing on the Gaza border for what could be a high-risk ground invasion of the tightly packed district. Across Gaza today, whole city blocks were reduced to rubble. No food or water is being allowed into the district, and the power is out. Gaza officials say more than 1,400 people are dead there and more than 6,000 wounded. Back in Tel Aviv today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived to give a strong show of support to Israel. Blinken, who is Jewish, addressed Hamas's atrocities.
It's beyond what anyone would ever want to imagine, much less actually see and, God forbid, experience.
Meanwhile, Hamas leaders are boasting about how they planned the assault, with a senior Hamas official telling Russian television that Hamas pretended to Israel that it was being more rational, while secretly it plotted the attacks.
We made them think that Hamas was busy with governing Gaza and that it wanted to focus on the 2.5 million Palestinians there and has abandoned the resistance altogether. All the while, under the table, Hamas was preparing for this big attack.
And today, the U.S. and the Gulf state of Qatar agreed to prevent Iran from accessing $6 billion in its funds that the U.S. had recently unfrozen, to widespread criticism. And as Israel pounds Gaza in the fiercest day of bombing yet, Israeli troops are massing on the Gaza border for what could be a high-risk ground invasion of the tightly packed district. We're joined now by Correspondent Ross Cullen, who is in Tel Aviv for us this evening. Ross, good to see you again. As more and more people see these horrific images of atrocities by Hamas, Israel is saying they are going to wipe out Hamas once and for all. How is that playing out?
Oh, Lindsay, there's no denying the images are shocking, beyond shocking. At times, the words that Antony Blinken used, depravity, inhumanity, some of the atrocities that were carried out, some of the attacks that were carried out in the villages of southern Israel by Hamas over the weekend. Really, you can understand the shock in the international community at that attack. Now, what is also worth bearing in mind is the fact that Israel is then retaliating with airstrikes, and we have seen days now of barrage of airstrikes. More than 6,000 bombs have been dropped on Gaza, which is just 25 miles long, with 2.5 million people living in that Palestinian territory. Now, Israel has stopped the water. It's turned off the electricity. It is not allowing food, fuel or medicine in. A blockade has been imposed on Gaza by Egypt and Israel since 2007. And so it is very hard for the people there to try to get access to the assistance that they need. And the World Health Organization on Thursday did release a statement. I'll read a very short section of that, Lindsay. It did say that the health system in the Gaza Strip is under breaking point. Time is running out to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. If fuel and life-saving health and humanitarian supplies cannot be urgently delivered, they're rationing how much electricity they use in the hospitals in Gaza because they only have a certain amount of fuel for their generators at the moment because there is no electricity being provided by Israel. So the entire situation, according to the United Nations and the World Food Programme, as well as the International Red Cross in Gaza, is deteriorating rapidly, and there urgently needs to be assistance. And Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, did also say on Thursday that there are going to be discussions about possible routes out for Palestinian civilians.
A humanitarian crisis there, indeed. Ross Cullen for us in Tel Aviv. Good to see you this evening. Stay safe. On Capitol Hill, support for Israel is running strong, with an overwhelming majority of members of Congress rallying behind calls for the U.S. to put actions behind words and offer unyielding support to Israel. Representative Tim Wahlberg, Republican of Michigan, has been a leading voice in support of Israel, and he joins us now. Congressman Walberg, welcome to the show. Good to see you this evening, sir.
Lindsay, it's good to be with you.
Okay, so we had Secretary of State Antony Blinken today in Israel meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you think that the U.S. sent the right message to the world and to Israel? And is Israel getting what it needs to win the war against Hamas?
Well, that's a question that we'll only know the answer to once the war has ended, or it progresses and we find out that we haven't sent enough. I'm glad that Secretary Blinken did show up there. I think that's a good point to make. I appreciate the president's statement yesterday as well. I think it helps our relationship, but it also establishes the fact for the world that America has not backed down in its support for our number one ally, if not in the world, certainly in the Middle East region. It's an earthquake zone there, and I'm glad that Prime Minister Netanyahu is back in power and leading what's going on in Israel. He's a man of moral clarity. And I hope that he understands that America, its Congress, still stands strongly in support of him, in spite of some of the things that you would see that really are untoward in the United States at this point in time.
Some of your Republican colleagues are calling for aid to Ukraine to be diverted to Israel. Do you support that?
Well, I think we ought to give what's necessary to Israel, and that doesn't mean that we have to take aid away from Ukraine either. Both are in a situation fighting for their lives, their destinies, fighting in support of their sovereignty as well. And I think we have the capabilities, certainly in our National Defense Authorization Act, as well as our Defense Appropriations Act. We have sent our funding to the Senate. And if they act on it, there will be funding that's necessary for Israel. So I'm hoping that the Senate will pass that legislation, not wait for the House to get a speaker in place and do a supplemental. Use the dollars that we put in place now. And I think that should be sufficient for the time being. And that's not political. I think it's time for the Senate to act on appropriations bills that we send and our Defense Authorization Act.
So one issue complicating the U.S.'s support for Israel is what you mentioned. There is no Speaker of the House right now. Congressman Steve Scalise was nominated to be the next Speaker of the House yesterday, but that seems unlikely right now. One of your colleagues, Republican Mike McCall, says that Republicans are playing a dangerous game with the speakership fight and warned of global consequences.
Well, I certainly agree with him. And having signed on to his letter, I think there are close to 400, if not over 400 members of Congress that have signed on to his resolution, standing in support of Israel and against Hamas. That's something that we have to have a seated Congress to enact and put forward. We can talk about it. I'm glad we're talking about it here on this program. And I would assume that Israel will have a chance to hear those things. But it'd be much better for Congress to be seated with a Speaker of the House and then taking any necessary steps as they come. And that would include a supplemental, if it's necessary, to make sure that the Iron Dome is still working, especially now that Hezbollah has joined the battle, and the expectations of thousands of incoming missiles coming from Lebanon area with Hezbollah, added to what Hamas is doing already. I think it's incumbent upon us to settle on a speaker. We thought we did that yesterday. Under our rules, the majority of our conference selects our speaker. Then we go to the floor. And as has been in the past, generally we pass the speaker vote in one successive voting process, not 15, but one. And I would hope in this time of context in the world and the challenging time that it is, we would get our act together. We'd accept the fact that Steve Scalise will be a good speaker. Some of us could have supported Jim Jordan. Some of us could support Steve Scalise. Now that the vote has been taken, I think all of us ought to support Speaker-elect Scalise in moving forward.
Let me ask you this before we go, because today a pro-Palestinian college student group is calling for a national day of resistance. And, you know, we are seeing Palestinian protests pop up all over the place, yet these protests don't seem to be condemning the horrific acts of Hamas, as we have seen babies beheaded, women raped, and so many other just horrific things. Now 27 Americans dead, 14 unaccounted for. Why aren't Palestinians standing up and taking on their own extremist?
That's a concern, and it's a concern that we've expressed about what's going on our college campuses today that will stand against almost anything except anti-Semitism. And so I authored a letter that has over 40 members of my colleagues signing on as well, asking Secretary of Education Cardonas to take a look at what's going on in college campuses and where there are anti-Semitic activities, including some in my home state of Michigan, that we start changing the vernacular there. It's not wrong for people to stand for the various ideologies, but when it starts to impact the safety, security, and lives of entities such as Jewish students on campus, we have a problem. To have demonstrations, that's America. To call for demonstrations at various places around the country, that's American. But when it starts to cause divisiveness that leads to violence, that's a problem. And when these rallies in Dearborn, for instance, the other night, did not mention the atrocities of women being raped, Jewish women being raped, their children murdered, decapitated, those type of things, we ought to stand against it. Even as we would say the innocents in Gaza, Palestinians who are dying as a result of this war, it's horrific and it ought to be stopped. But it was started by one group, and that was Hamas. Remember that. It was not Israel that started this. Israel is the one that gives free electricity, water, and security to the Palestinians. They have given freedom for Palestinians to come into Israel, to be in the inside of the old wall of Jerusalem. Palestinian women are given more freedom in Israel than they are in the Palestinian Authority. So I think we have to call it for what it is. This was an aggressive, horrific, terrorist act by Hamas, and they must be wiped off the face of the earth.
Congressman Tim Wahlberg, appreciate your time this evening. Thanks for being with us.